All right, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Good morning, or maybe good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. My name is Kyle Empringham, and I'm going to start by acknowledging the territory that I'm on, which is the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And because we're a national charity, there are different territories depending on where you are today. I know some of our speakers are coming from quite literally the other side of the country. And so I acknowledge the land that I'm on, and I hope and challenge everyone to understand the traditional territories that you're on. There are a lot of great resources that are available online in order to help at least gather a start of an understanding of what it means to acknowledge territory. Again, my name is Kyle Empringham. I'm the co-founder of the Starfish Canada. And so it's great to have you here. The first, a couple really quick things that I'll note is that we are recording this call. So that's so people who are unable to attend can watch these stories later on. And so if there's a degree of that is uncomfortable for you, feel free to use the chat. The chat function goes to the host, Devon, and myself. And so if you have any questions or concerns about things, of course, feel free to let me know. But that's enough from me. I'm going to pass it to our host, who is a top 25 winner from 2018 and also runs the Kitchener-Waterloo Library of Things and now works at Humber College. Please give it up for Devon Fernandes.
Thanks a lot, Kyle. It's funny. I was kind of expecting applause, but I think we'll do what we can with the chat function today, as each of you are talking. Thank you, Kyle. One thing that I'm really excited about is that Kyle didn't call me an old winner, just a past winner. And I think as we're hearing all of your different stories today, it's really going to be an impactful experience for all of us. So today is really going to be about hearing the different stories that have impacted each of the winners. So there'll be no slides, no gimmicks, just stories as pure as they're able to share them. And they can be stories that impacted their individual experience or different initiatives that they're running. So the Starfish Canada provided some light coaching to frame the story, but you can trust that these are all true stories that have really impacted them. And each person's going to have around 5 minutes to share their story. But before we pass it to each of the winners, we'd like to do a virtual high five. So we have Dan Walker, who's the social impact lead at Arc'teryx here, who would like to just give a few words to congratulate all of us, really. So I'll pass it over to Dan.
Awesome. Thanks, Devon. Yeah, hello to everyone. I'm coming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As Devon mentioned, I'm at Arc'teryx. I work on our sustainability team, focused on social impact. So really saying, as a brand, what matters to us, what are our values, and then how do we start to bring those to life? Kyle reached out a few weeks back around the work that you're doing and was fortunate enough to have a conversation and share some of the amazing work that you've already been doing. I was blown away to read the biographies of the things that you've achieved so far. Yeah, delighted to be able to come on and listen to some of the stories that you're sharing about your adventures and the work you're doing. Congratulations. I think it's phenomenal what you've achieved so far. And I'm really excited too. I think seeing the work that you're doing, it's especially important at a time like now. We see the challenges in the world. We're in an interesting moment. The health challenges are unquestioned, and that has to be the priority to resolve. But there's also this opportunity of redefining the world in which we live. And I think the work that you're engaged in and the work that you will be engaged in over the coming years will be, I really look forward to seeing that. So yeah, huge congratulations. And as I was thinking about having this moment to sort of to share with you and to congratulate you, I was also thinking, is there anything that I'd want you to take away as you go out and to continue the work that you're doing? And the one piece that keeps coming up for me is the importance of community and having that inclusive perspective in terms of any of the work that we're doing. How are we including all voices in that conversation? So that would really be my ask as you go forward, is to prioritize that and the importance of having all voices heard in whatever work you're pursuing. Yeah, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with in the coming years. So congratulations. Good to see you all.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan. Really appreciate those words. One thing before we kind of move forward is that I really encourage you to use the chat function and the Q&A function on Zoom. So you can use the chat function to submit questions to Kyle and myself. One thing that I think is really interesting is that each of the different finalists can also submit questions. So sometimes it's great to hear, I know when we did this a couple of years ago, it was great to hear questions from the audience, but it's also great to hear what the other finalists' impressions are, because each story is really different and kind of weaves together. So we recommend using the speaker view in Zoom if you can, so that you can focus on the storyteller as they're speaking, and use the reaction feature if you like as well to signal a thumbs up or applause at the bottom of your screen. So our goal is to be wrapped up. I really appreciate all the applause, or the thumbs up, Kyle. It really adds to it. So our goal is to be wrapped up in about 45 minutes. So we'll see what we do, but I'd like to introduce our first finalist, who's going to share a bit about their story. So Alison Gu, I've been actually following Alison's work for quite some time. Her work related to Climate Strike Canada since I started reading about it in Alternatives Journal. And so today I'm really interested to hear a bit more about her story, especially conversations that she had from her cross-country cycling trip. So I'm sure we have tons to learn that can apply to so many different fields, but I'll turn it over to Alison.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I am on unceded Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish land currently as well. But yeah, I'll just get into it. So in 2017, a friend and I were on this big bike trip, and we found ourselves cycling through this very small town in Manitoba called St. Lazare. And we stopped here because we had completely run out of food and we needed groceries. And the next town was at least another 3-hour bike ride away. Unfortunately, the town only had one grocery store and it was closed. So we headed into the only one open restaurant there was. And we had some early brunch, lunch kind of thing. It was your typical cozy family-owned diner. We could see the cook, who was also the owner, frying up our eggs, but after his daughter took our order. And the furniture didn't match, but in the way that it feels like it all matches because it doesn't match, if that makes sense. And while we were waiting for our food, this man turns to us and he goes, "What, you two biking across Canada or something?" And my bike partner and I looked at each other and were like, actually, yeah. And we chatted about our route and how long we'd been riding for. These were the common questions that we got. And he introduced himself as Terry, and then asked us whether we were doing it for a reason or if we were just crazy. And I explained that we were raising money for Indigenous land and water defenders who were taking Kinder Morgan, who was the company that owned Trans Mountain at the time, to court. And he goes, so we got some left-leaning Trudeau supporters here, eh? And my bike partner and I were like, well, I'd say we're a bit more left than Trudeau. And Terry goes, more left than Trudeau? What is that, like Fidel Castro? And we're like, no. We talked a lot about politics, and relatively early on, we started talking about Trump. And he was a supporter, and most of this 300-person town was as well. We argued about everything from like being pro-choice versus pro-life to the cuts that had been recently made to the EPA. But he also acknowledged that despite disagreeing on everything else, that he was really glad to see that we were doing what we were doing. He's Cree, and he talked to us about how Indigenous people have always been the most responsible stewards of the land. And at the end, he acknowledged that he was really happy to have had the respectful conversation and dialogue about differing opinions. He emphasized multiple times how grateful he was to have been listened to. And he even paid for our meals at the end and asked us to write down our website so that he could donate. And when I left that conversation, I was just like, my head was spinning. First of all, coming away with the feeling that I was so damn privileged to be able to stay calm enough to have like a respectful conversation about some of the things that we discussed. Even though, of course, it's important to remember that someone who does become emotional when discussing these hard topics is not less valid in their argument. They're probably speaking directly from facts of personal experience, primary source, gold standard. But it's also important to remember that because they're putting more of themselves out there, more often for the purpose of education, that this is really exhausting and taxing on their part. But anyway, I was extremely privileged to have this conversation without feeling extremely emotional. But I also was wondering, like, what if it didn't make a difference? Should I have been more aggressive instead of like just trying to listen to him and try to like counter very peacefully? Did I change anything that he thought about? And is that possible? How does that happen if somebody's surrounded by like a political view that they've known their entire life? Can one conversation move somebody when values are so deeply ingrained that anything else seems wrong? As I biked the rest of the day, I realized that the least important thing was probably the content that we covered in that conversation. Looking back 3 years later, I can't remember half of what we talked about, but I do remember how genuine he was in thanking us at the end. And the most important thing that we did that day was just to have had an in-person, honest discussion where we listened to someone who felt left behind. I didn't, and I still don't even come close to condoning any of what he preached, but he didn't come up with those thoughts himself. Someone else did, and then that inevitably came with a community that continued and probably continues to this day to influence his belief system. And of course, this at the end of the day can cause a lot of harm. I think that it's important that we have to remember that if we have the privilege to, it's really, really important to engage in person with people. There are, of course, people that intentionally weave these narratives of hatred, and of course, we have to fight against all of that with like everything that we have. But most of the people who uphold the systems of racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, it goes on and on and on, do so because that's the status quo and the context that they're in and that they know. And that there's a reason why people stay in these environments, because they don't feel like they belong in others. So even though that conversation may not have changed Terry's mind, I hope that it was enough for him to want to continue to engage in conversations with people that he disagrees with. And the biggest lesson that I took away from that conversation was that this kind of work is my responsibility. Because I need to choose to believe that most people have good intentions and that they're inherently good people, and let that influence how I come into a conversation. And because we're human, we can't do that behind, internet anonymity and tweeting character limits. Because when we can see and hear and experience somebody's humanity and fallibility, something as like intangible as believing in somebody's goodness, it becomes like in reach and possible, and we can actually bring them into our movements, and we can make good on our promises of actually leaving nobody behind.
Thank you, Alison, for sharing that really powerful story with us. There were so many pieces in there. Oh, yes, I have to also give you my reaction. There are so many pieces in there that were really interesting. I think from the humanity that you talked about, and even from the kind of focus on making sure that you can connect with people. We'll probably have to transition for the next while to doing it virtually, but I can definitely see that, and I have so many questions for you personally that we'll talk about later. I think one thing that's going to become more and more apparent as we go through each of the next finalists as well is the idea of going coast to coast and journeying near and far to kind of connect different stories. So the way that Alison talked about going across Canada and trying to connect with different people's humanity is definitely something that I think we'll hear more about from our next finalists. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten Reid. So when we talk about working coast to coast to coast, Kirsten did fieldwork in the Yukon, in the Northwest Territories, and used it as a tool to advocate for science-based climate policy, which I think is all the more important every passing day. So I'm really excited to hear about that work and the story you have to tell. So I'll pass it over.
Thanks, Devon. So in August 2018, I was in central Yukon completing my last day of field work for the summer. And the last thing that I had to do was set up my final trail camera. And so this camera was positioned so that it would take pictures every single day, so I knew how much snow was on the ground. But it was also motion sensitive, so it was going to take pictures every time an animal walked past, so I knew which animals were living there. So I got it all set up, everything was working fine. I left the site, I headed south, I headed back to Newfoundland with plans to return to the site about 10 months later. And unbeknownst to me, 2 days after I leave the site, a grizzly bear comes along and it knocks over my camera so that it's no longer facing my site. It's not taking the pictures that I need it to take, but it's actually taking pictures of the highway a couple hundred meters in the background. And every single time a vehicle passes by, it takes a picture of this vehicle. So, like Devon said, my name is Kirsten Reid. I'm a PhD candidate at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Memorial is on the traditional territory of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, and the Innu of Nitassinan and Nuutuavut. And for my PhD research, I'm exploring the relationships between different plant and animal communities throughout the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And my favorite part about this research is spending 3 months every summer working throughout Northern Canada and spending time at each of my sites to see what's happening and how well all my instruments are working. So my sites are spread out over about 1,300 kilometers of highway throughout the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. That's approximately the same distance as Toronto to Thunder Bay or Vancouver to Saskatoon, and all of this is on gravel highways. So due to the Arctic's long winters and pretty short summers, there's about 3 months of the whole year that I can get into all of my sites and get all my work done without there being too much snow on the ground or it being too cold to work. And since I live in Newfoundland for the rest of the year, it's not very easy to make an extra trip to one of the sites if I forget something. So because of the short season and the very complicated logistics of getting to these sites, I spend much of the time that I'm not in the field planning what I'm going to be doing when I am there. What do I need to measure? What do I need to fix? Which plants do I need to look for? And because my sites are spread so far apart from each other, there's only a certain amount of time that I can spend at each site before I need to move to the next one. So in the end, my summer is usually planned out in 30-minute chunks of time. The remote nature of my sites means that if I'm forgetting something, I can't easily make a trip to the hardware store or call my boss and ask her opinion. I'm on my own with my other graduate students or research assistants, but it's up to me how to deal with the situation. And what I've learned from doing Arctic fieldwork for the past 6 years is that you can plan and plan and plan as much as you want and have everything perfect in theory and on paper. But the weather and the roads and the animals and the site conditions and a whole bunch of other things that you've never even thought of make field work unpredictable, and rolling with the punches becomes extremely necessary. A huge part about doing research in these sorts of environments is learning to be adaptable and to make plans on the fly. It's learning which measurements can wait until later because there's simply not enough time to do them right now. And it's learning how to rewire a sensor because the bear chewed through it. Or it's learning how to stabilize the equipment because the ground's not very secure and the animals manage to keep knocking it over. And so if I had to tell pre-grad school Kirsten one thing, it would be that this stuff happens to everyone. Even the scientists that you think are the coolest and are totally unflappable and haven't experienced challenges in their work. They have. And it's an important skill to be able to roll with the punches and to adapt on the go. By experiencing these ups and downs and situations that in the moment seem insurmountable and project ending, I've learned that it's how you adapt from these situations that's the most important. The setbacks and the unpredictability are just part of field work, but they contribute to making it such a memorable experience. And when I look back on the past summers of field work, it's not these kind of bad situations that come to mind first. It's seeing the midnight sun and the northern lights over the course of a single summer. And it's chewing on muktuk or whale blubber at the shore of the Arctic Ocean with my friends. And it's seeing the caribou herds up close and dozens of bears and lynx and moose. And finally, it's getting serenaded by a family of German karaoke singers in the land of the midnight sun and trying to sing along despite not knowing German polka songs. And it's these fun and crazy events that keep me going when I'm in the field and it's raining for days, or when I get my 4th flat tire of the summer and I have to drive over 500 kilometers so I can get a spare, and I lose a day of work because I'm trying to source a tire from down south. So research and field work are very unpredictable by nature, but rolling with the punches becomes a necessary survival skill.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that story. There were so many parts in there about kind of adapting to setbacks that are inevitable that really kind of tie into Alison's story about, you know what, you're going to stumble upon something that you didn't expect. And I think that's something that, especially now with us even doing this virtually, is something that becomes more and more important as we're, especially when you're thinking about adventures near and far, is something that is something that's constantly in the back of your mind. So I really appreciate those. And I'd encourage people, as soon as you have questions, just put them right in the group chat, and so we can keep the dialogue going after we introduce the next finalist. So that being said, I'm going to turn the mic over to Leah Davidson, who last but not least is our final finalist for today. And she had an experience of a lifetime in Antarctica and took adventure to the next level through art, poetry, and a collection of different mediums. And so I'm really interested to hear what she has to say. And so I'd welcome her to share her story.
Hi, my name is Leah. Growing up, I knew that conservation was important, but I struggled to remember to do the simple tasks like minimizing water use or remembering to recycle. It just didn't seem to resonate with me personally, and even though I understood the importance of the planet, it still felt like hard work. And I really wanted to get to the root of why climate change matters and why we need to preserve the natural environment. And I saw a listing online to apply for a scholarship with students on ice to travel to Antarctica. And I never known anyone who had been to Antarctica, and I wasn't even sure whether it was legitimate, but I decided to apply. And I guess a few months later, I had discovered that I was one of the scholarship recipients with the Lee Cross Foundation, and I'd been selected for a 2-week expedition to the South Pole. And that was over like December, January, which was summer in Antarctica. And it was a really tremendous experience because it was my first major travel journey, and I was just super excited. So the expedition consisted of myself, around 59 other youth from around the world, and 30 experts, which included scientists, artists, authors, environmentalists, professors, so many different people coming together to share their perspective. And the first step to getting to Antarctica, well, it's quite a long journey, so you have to fly. We flew through Argentina. We spent some time in Ushuaia, which is the southernmost city in the world, and then boarded a ship and then crossed the Drake Passage, which is where all of the oceans converge. So the Indian, Atlantic, Pacific oceans come together, and it's the roughest seas in the world. So basically it feels like you're being submerged underwater. You look out the deck, and you look out the window, and you can basically see the ship looking like it's going underwater because of the waves. And when you go up, you're basically surfing, trying to keep your balance. And there are like seasickness bags all across like the ship. It's really a unique experience. It lasts a couple of days, and then we entered Antarctica itself. And I was there for about 2 weeks. So we had various workshops, like online onboard classes, like shipboard education, and then we went out on Zodiac boats, which are inflatable rafts. We're able to get close to the wildlife and see penguins up close, like millions of penguins, and the chicks which were just hatching. And it was a tremendous experience to have that intimate connection with nature and to see life happen before your eyes. So we saw the process of birth and of like chicks hatching and taking and baby penguins taking their first step, and we saw the life cycle of death of leopard seals like tearing apart penguins, and like whale carcasses on the beaches. And it was just really fascinating to just see what happens to nature when there's not a lot of human intervention. And when we went up to see the penguins, a lot of them weren't scared of humans because they'd never seen us before, and so they came pretty close. And it just showed me how we really changed and distorted our relationship with nature and with wildlife, and instilled this fear which wasn't supposed to be there initially. And there was also a really transformational moment where we went onto like an ice floe, and we were in the middle of nowhere and had no connectivity that whole time. We were sending blog posts back by satellite, but otherwise no internet. We're really losing track of time as well, because in Antarctica the daylight lasts almost 24 hours during the summer months. And we were like on this ice floe that seemed like endless ice, and Jeff Greene, who's the founder of Students on Ice, told us to just take a moment, distance ourselves, and just reflect on where we were and our concept of time. And it was completely silent, like you couldn't hear anything, and we couldn't remember the last time we had seen another human being. The only humans that we saw on our expedition besides each other were the researchers at the American Research Base. And it was it really just showed me that the concept of time is something that we've created in our world to like regulate work and our lives. But when you just take the moment to like appreciate the passing of time, and even like lose the sense of like what you have to do the next day, or other people, and just really focus on how beautiful the world is, and that feeling of love, and that feeling of just being in awe of the natural beauty, really transformed my perspective on the environment. I really started to love nature. I really started to want to protect it because of just how beautiful it was. And every day when the ice was so different, like in some places it was these huge icebergs, other places it was like smaller, like ice that kind of was like shattered on the surface and was reflective of the sunlight or the clouds. And then other times we saw like ice, we saw like glaciers and like ice calving off of it, so basically falling in and like forming an iceberg. And all the different colors, like some of it was blue and green and white, and it was just really tremendous. It really changed my perspective as well on ice and how beautiful it is. And when I also learned at the end of the expedition about the Antarctic Treaty, which was a treaty that was signed in like around 1959 and ratified again in 1991, and now there are 48 signatories, maybe more now, but basically it's countries that group together to protect Antarctica and keep it free from military intervention. You can't dispose of radioactive waste, and it's illegal to hunt, mine, or fish commercially. And this may not last forever. There's like a moratorium, and they'll revisit it in 2041, but it just showed me that it's something that's really important to preserve, and not many people know about Antarctica, and we're the next generation. And I feel a personal sense of responsibility to advocate for why the preservation and awareness of Antarctica is so important, and why we need to not exploit the natural resources there. And then when I came back, I did a lot of education in my community, giving speeches, publishing a book, starting a new discipline at my university around art and sustainability. But I really advocated for the emotional side of climate change communications, and that it's not just about scientific facts, but we really need to get people to care about it. And that can take many different forms. Sometimes it's art, sometimes it's science, sometimes it's like a mix. But we need to bring youth outside in experiential learning and regain that connection with nature, whether it's through hiking or camping or boating on the lake, but just experience how beautiful it is. And then I feel like that those experiences at an early age can have a transformational effect on your career journey and your relationship with the world, and why you care about climate change, and why you do the lifestyle changes, and why you have and why you advocate for sustainability in your daily life. And so for me, it was like kind of seeing the big picture and really falling in love with the planet that made those other acts second nature. And it was a really special opportunity.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. There are so many pieces about that I could really relate to. My background is actually in psychology and sustainability, so the idea to connect people kind of really resonated with each of your different stories. So as we kind of heard from all the different finalists, I'd encourage you to enter your questions into the chat box. They can be for each other, they can be for one specific finalist, or they can be for all of them. I have my own questions that I'm really excited to get to ask, either here or offline. But while we're waiting, I think some of the questions that we already have trickling in are so one is for Alison. it's have you met any other Terrys in your climate action work, other than your your experience traveling across Canada? And have you used any different strategies to deal with opposition?
Well, when I was organizing the climate strike at McGill, I was emailing profs to try to get their, like, I guess, messages of support and just to help broadcast it to their classes at the beginning of class. And this chemistry teacher actually emailed back and he just said, like, it was this big thing about like March 15th, blah, 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 blah. And he just said, climate change is not real. And the science is not like confirmed or something like that. And I was like, this is a tenured chemistry professor. And the way that I dealt with that one was that I talked to the school newspapers about it. Because sometimes you just can't win, you know, and there's no way that prof would have had a conversation with me.
It's funny, I'm seeing a couple comments that are saying like, good for you, Alison, after you said that. There's always an approach to trying addressing these situations, right? Like there's that conversation. Sometimes it needs to be escalated in different ways. But yeah, there's Terrys, I'm sure, in all our different lives. And that just means we have to kind of like work with them in different ways and make sure that we're collaborating. So another question here is for Kirsten. Could you speak more to how your research has influenced climate policy?
I don't think, I mean, to date, my research hasn't explicitly influenced climate policy, but the hope is going forward, we can use my research to sort of make some predictions about where and when species are going to be, based on sort of where they are now and where we think they're going to be with further warming in the north. And so how can we look to sort of protect those species or just protect the landscapes that they're in based on sort of these predictive models of where we think they're going to go.
Great. Yeah, and I feel like that's always an evolving target, is for science to contribute incrementally over time. It's not going to be a giant fix all of a sudden, but I can definitely see that having an impact for sure. A question for Leah. How did you plan for your trip? Was there anything interesting or unexpected that you had to prepare for?
We had a pre-trip curriculum that we went through to cover the basic history, some of the science around what we would be experiencing in the polar region. So I did that. And then just like my own research and figuring out what I wanted to get from the experience. So I decided to spend a lot of time blogging and capturing video and photos so that I could then deliver sustainability presentations when I came back to Canada. So that was another thing that I was focused on while I was there, is capturing the right footage so that I could use it in advocacy.
For sure, yeah, and I'm sure while you're preparing for it, I know if I was going to do that, like I feel like there's no prep work that's enough to prepare you for something like that. But I'm sure that would definitely help. Another question for Alison. Where was the most physically challenging portion of your trip versus the most mentally challenging, and why?
I think physically challenging was also mentally challenging. Alberta, the Rockies, physically and mentally, for all of the reasons that you might imagine. I remember when we were biking into Medicine Hat, their slogan is actually like where gas was first discovered, or something like that. The original gas town, or something like that. So.
Yeah, I feel like the mental and the physical piece definitely go together, and yeah, there's probably no shortage of stories from your trip. A question for Kirsten. How is climate change directly affecting different plants and animals in northern Canada? Is there one species that stands out to you that people should know about?
Ooh, good question. So particularly for plants, we know that oftentimes their northern distribution is limited by climate. So it gets too cold at a certain latitude, and so the plants can't grow north of there. And that's just kind of how it is and how these plant distributions happen. But as the planet starts to get warmer, and in the north, the north is experiencing kind of high, or the north is experiencing a lot of warming. And so as it warms in the north, you basically, the thermal tolerances of these plants are where they can grow is gonna change. So if it's kind of too cold above this line traditionally, then as it gets warmer, it's now too cold above this line. So there's this whole kind of chunk of space in here where these plants can now grow. And so it's not just going to be a case of one plant that's growing further north. There's going to be a whole bunch of plants that are changing. And as these plants change their distribution, then the animals that feed on them are going to change their distribution. So there's just going to be a whole bunch of species moving in concert. And I think the kind of example that everyone thinks of is typically either trees or shrubs. And so for trees, black spruce is being shown to expand their range. So kind of typically above the tree line, you have tundra where there's no trees. But as it gets warmer and the trees can move further north, then they're going to sort of invade the tundra, as it were. And so you're going to have this ground that is typically not forested, and the animals there aren't used to it being forested. But as it warms and as we have sort of more fires at higher latitudes, we're going to see these black spruce trees in particular move further northward.
That was a great question and a great answer. So I really appreciate learning about that personally. There's a question for both Kirsten and Leah. Warming at the poles is super scary and feels inevitable. As you've learned more about it, has your fear increased? Is there anything that you learned that has surprised you, either good or bad? I'm really interested to hear your perspectives on that, both of you. Leah, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I guess when I was there, we didn't see a lot of visible effects of climate change since we didn't see it over time. It was hard to tell, but I did speak to a lot of people from Aboriginal communities who were on the trip as well. So I was able to get a bit of the Arctic perspective, and they were talking about the melting of permafrost and how that was leading to their homes being unstable and also new plant species appearing that their elders had no traditional words to describe. And so I think I saw through those conversations that it was having a lot of impact on human life as well. And I know that in Antarctica, the temperature has increased by around 3 degrees Celsius over the last 50 years. So it's definitely something that I am very concerned about and want to raise awareness about. And I think, I think it's definitely something that's top of mind, and trying to communicate something that's really remote and not as visible to people in a way that they can understand and care about is an ongoing challenge.
For sure, yeah. And Kirsten, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say a similar thing. Like permafrost is one of the first thing that comes to mind for me too. So that's ground that is at or below 0 degrees for 2 or more years. So it's kind of typically very stable ground, and a lot of people in northern communities end up living on top of permafrost because that's all that's there. And so I've had the opportunity to go to Tuktoyaktuk a couple of times, and that's sort of right on the Arctic Ocean. It's the northernmost road accessible community in Canada. And in Tuktoyaktuk, you can literally see the houses kind of slumping off into the water. And so people there who are having to move homes, it's just sort of like a really prevalent example of climate change. And also when I'm driving around up there, you can sort of see off in the not too distant landscape the thaw slumps, which again is permafrost thawing and just kind of like slumping right down the hill there. So that's going to have huge changes to the plants and the animals and just everything that's living in that general environment.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like when you're studying climate change, oftentimes it's the more you know that you kind of get a bit more intimidated, but at the same time, that knowledge can be very powerful. So I definitely appreciate that. I have one last question here for all of you. Sometimes there's one person who plays a really important and supportive role for all of us. What are some characteristics and behaviors of your best supporters? Alison, would you like to take the first stab at this? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Sure. Characteristics. I think just like encouragement and belief. I think that climate change is something that feels very impossible to tackle, especially if it's such a global problem. And it can feel so like lonely to feel like you're one small person against this huge problem. But like people supporting you and cheering you on can be, it can help you feel less lonely, but also working with people who are working on the same thing and who you have like a community with or relationship with, who support you in what they do and what you do, that can help it feel like it's less lonely and just keep you going.
I couldn't agree more. Kirsten, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say too, it's like people just like showing up when it matters. Like I got 3 big supporters on this call today, so I'm grateful that they're all here and listening and taking time out of their day to do that and listen to me and everybody else. So yeah, I think just kind of showing up when it matters.
Yeah, for sure. And Leah, anything to add?
Yeah, I think a lot of my biggest supporters have been instrumental in opening doors for me, or pointing out opportunities that would fit well with my interests and skills, and also providing regular feedback on my professional development journey.
For sure. And it's great to hear about those kind of people who help push you forward. And it's funny that sometimes you can feel very alone, as Alison mentioned, when you're working on such a big problem, but hearing other people's stories can often like provide you that fuel. So I know today when I go back to work, I actually feel really energized to have that impact in so many different ways, like all of you have done as well. So I think that's actually a great way to conclude today's session, but I really want to thank each of you for sharing your stories with us. They were really, really interesting. I'm probably going to message each one of you individually with my own questions afterwards. And I want to thank everyone else who joined us virtually. As this is our kind of new normal, it's really great to see so much engagement and really interesting questions that can weave together a great story. So I want to thank everyone one last time. And then I also want to mention that we do have other virtual sessions where we're going to be hearing from the other finalists. And those are all on the Starfish Canada's Facebook. And you can go there for more details or to register. So I will leave it at that, and I'll pass it over to Kyle to say any last words.
Awesome. Big hand for Devon as well for doing a great job of hosting us and facilitating the conversation today. Really appreciate you stepping up and helping us out here. Thank you everyone for participating and for submitting amazing questions. And we hope to see you at another virtual event soon. I hope you all have a great day.